Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Murder Tapes podcast, Season 3, Episode 7. My mom and little brother came to visit us over the weekend, which was a lot of fun, and we took them to Alamo Drafthouse to see the new Harold and the Purple Crayon movie. As soon as I saw that they were coming out with the movie for it, I literally counted down the days because that was my favorite book growing up. So just like Despicable Me, I'm sure I was way more excited to see it than he was. But aside from that, we hung out and chilled at home, which was very much needed since we'll be moving to our first 2-bedroom apartment soon, which I'm really excited for because Wilson and I started out with a tiny studio and then we had 2 one-bedrooms. And so now we can finally have a guest room / office space. And the goal is to eventually have some podcast episodes for you guys to actually watch along with interviews. But enough about me. I hope you all had a great weekend, and let's get into today's case. Today we're going to be talking about the Katherine Mary Knight case. I had heard about this case quite a while back, but I never fully read into all of the details. Katherine Mary Knight was born on October 24th, 1955 at Tenterfield Hospital in northwestern New South Wales. She came into the world 30 minutes after her twin sister, Joy. Katherine's family background was complex. Her mother, Barbara, had 4 sons, Patrick, Martin, Neville, and Barry, from a previous marriage, and had one more, Charlie, with Katherine's father, Ken. Another son, Shane, would join the family in 1961. When Barbara's first marriage ended, the 2 older boys, Patrick and Martin, remained with their father, Jack Rogan, while Neville and Barry were sent to live with an aunt in Sydney. After Jack Rogan's death in 1959, Patrick and Martin returned to live with their mother. Ken Knight, Katherine's father, was an alcoholic and slaughterman, which meant his job took him and his family across Queensland and New South Wales. They moved from town to town, working grueling 12-hour shifts in various abattoirs, places like Wallangarra, Gunnedah, Tenterfield, and Murray. It wasn't until 1969 that the family finally settled in Aberdeen, where Ken found a steady position at the local abattoir. Her father would use violence and intimidation to rape her mother more than 10 times a day. Barbara frequently shared personal and intimate details of her sex life with her daughters, expressing her dislike for both sex and men. When Katherine confided in her about a partner, insisting she engage in a sexual act that she was uncomfortable with, Barbara advised her to put up with it and stop complaining. Katherine has alleged that she suffered repeated sexual abuse from various family members, although she asserts that her father was not among them. This abuse reportedly continued until she turned 11. While some details of her account raise minor questions among mental health professionals, psychiatrists largely accept her claims as all family members have corroborated that the abuse took place. During her time at Muswellbrook High School, she became increasingly isolated and is remembered by her peers as a bully who intimidated smaller children by standing over them. She was involved in at least one incident where she assaulted a schoolmate with a weapon and was also injured by a teacher acting in self-defense. However, outside of her fits of rage, Katherine was a commendable student who often received accolades for her behavior. After leaving school at the age of 15 without acquiring basic literacy skills, such as reading and writing, she found work as a cutter in a clothing factory. A year later, she transitioned to what she described as her dream job at a local butchery, where she initially cut up offal, which is the internal organs of an animal, and swiftly ascended to the role of boner. This meant that she was removing meat from the animal bones and carcasses. She received her own set of butcher knives. Katherine's most prized possession was her set of razor-sharp boning knives, which she kept on display above her bed so that, quote, they would always be handy if I needed them. Each night, she would admire them before falling asleep, her thoughts perhaps lingering on the work she did and the animals that she processed. From a young age, she was immersed in an environment that conditioned her for a life of brutality, a life that would eventually culminate in horrific acts of violence. By the age of 16, Katherine was working alongside her father, twin sister Joy, and brother Charlie at the Aberdeen Abattoir. In a predominantly male industry, Katherine quickly earned a reputation for being as tough as any of the men. Her fiery temperament and sharp language were well known. She wasn't one to back down from a challenge. With her knife always at hand, she had a habit of confronting anyone who offended her, and no one ever dared to take her on. In 1973, Katherine crossed paths with David Stanford Kellett, a hard-drinking co-worker whom she quickly came to dominate. Whenever David found himself in a fight at the hotel, Katherine was there to back him up with her fists. Known in Aberdeen for her aggressive demeanor, Katherine often challenged anyone who upset her to armed combat. Katherine married David in 1974 at her request, arriving at the wedding on her motorcycle with an inebriated David on the pillion. Upon their arrival, Katherine's mother Barbara gave David a stark warning. Quote, "The old girl told me to be careful. You better watch this one or she'll fucking kill you. Stir her up the wrong way or do the wrong thing and you're fucked. Don't ever think of playing up on her. She'll fucking kill you." And that was her mother talking. She said I should know that something's not right with her. She's got a screw loose somewhere. On their wedding night, Katherine attempted to strangle David because he fell asleep after only 3 sexual encounters. The marriage was marked by extreme violence. On one occasion, while heavily pregnant, Katherine burned all of David's clothing and shoes, and then struck him over the head with a frying pan, simply because he arrived home late from a darts competition after making the finals. In fear of his life, David fled, collapsing at a neighbor's house and later requesting treatment for a severe skull fracture. Although the police wanted to press charges, Katherine persuaded David to drop them by behaving well and convincing him to forgive her. On another occasion, when David opened the front door, Katherine swung a hot iron at him, scalding the side of his face. The pattern of the iron was burned onto the side of his cheek. When he returned to work the next day, he secretly got medical assistance. He was too afraid to get help the night it happened because Katherine would know if he told the doctor and the police would have been called. In May 1976, shortly after the birth of their first child, Melissa Ann, David left Katherine for another woman and moved to Queensland. Unable to cope with Katherine's possessive and violent behavior, David sought a fresh start. The day after his departure, Katherine was seen aggressively pushing her baby stroller down the street, violently shaking it from side to side. She was admitted to St. Elmo's Hospital in Tamworth, where she was diagnosed with postnatal depression and spent several weeks recovering. After her release, Katherine placed Melissa on a railway line shortly before a train was due to pass. She then stole an axe, went into town, and threatened several people with it. Old Ted, a local man foraging near the tracks, found and rescued Melissa just minutes before the train arrived. Katherine was arrested and taken back to St. Elmo's Hospital, but signed herself out the following day. A few days later, Katherine attacked a woman with one of her knives, demanding that she drive her to Queensland to find David. The woman escaped after they stopped at a service station, but by the time the police arrived, Katherine had taken a young boy hostage and was threatening him with a knife. The police managed to disarm her using brooms, and Katherine was admitted to Morisset Psychiatric Hospital. She told the nurses that her plan was to kill the mechanic who had repaired David's car, followed by David and his mother once she reached Queensland. When the police informed David of these events, he left his girlfriend and, along with his mother, moved back to Aberdeen to support Katherine. In 1986, Katherine met 38-year-old miner David Saunders. I'll be referring to him as Saunders, since this is the second David. A few months after their meeting, Saunders moved in with Katherine and her 2 daughters, though he kept his old apartment in Scone. Katherine quickly became possessive and jealous of Saunders' activities when she wasn't around, leading to frequent arguments and expulsions. Saunders would retreat to his apartment in Scone, only for Katherine to follow him and beg him to return. In May 1987, Katherine demonstrated her volatility by cutting the throat of Saunders' 2-month-old dingo pup in front of him, using the act as a warning of what might happen if he ever had an affair. Following this disturbing display, She knocked Sonder unconscious with a frying pan. In June 1988, Katherine gave birth to her third daughter, Sarah. This prompted Sonder to put a deposit on a house, which Katherine paid off in 1989 once her workers' compensation came through. The house was decorated by Katherine with odd items, including animal skins, skulls, horns, rusty traps, leather jackets, old boots, machetes, rakes, and pitchforks. Not a single space, including the ceilings, was left untouched. Following a particularly violent argument, Katherine hit Sonder in the face with an iron and then stabbed him in the stomach with a pair of scissors. Sonder moved back to Scone after this incident, but when he returned home, he discovered that Katherine had cut up all of his clothes. Sonder subsequently took a long service leave and went into hiding. Katherine tried to locate him, but no one would reveal his whereabouts. Several months later, Sonder returned to visit his daughter and learned that Katherine had gone to the police, claiming that she was afraid of him. The police issued an apprehended violence order, or AVO, against him. In 1990, Katherine became pregnant by her former coworker from the abattoir, John Chillingworth, who was 43 at the time. The couple welcomed a son named Eric the following year. However, their relationship lasted only 3 years, as Katherine eventually left Chillingworth for John Price, with whom she had been having an affair. It's kind of weird that she dated 2 Davids and 2 Johns. John Pricey Price was a father of 3 when he engaged in an affair with Katherine. Known as a terrific bloke who was well liked by those around him, Price's marriage had ended in 1988. His 2-year-old daughter stayed with his ex-wife, while his 2 older children lived with him. Fully aware of Katherine's violent background, Price welcomed her into his home in 1995. The children took a liking to her, and with Price making a good income from his job in the local mines, their life initially seemed idyllic, despite occasional violent confrontations. However, in 1998, a major fight erupted after Price declined to marry Katherine. In a retaliatory move, she recorded a video of items he had taken from work and sent it to his employer. Although these items were outdated medical kits salvaged from the company's trash, the fallout was severe. Price was terminated from his 17-year position that same day. Following the incident, he ended their relationship, and Katherine returned to her home, where news of her actions quickly spread throughout the town. Despite their breakup, a few months later, Price and Katherine rekindled their relationship, but he was adamant that she would not move in with him again. As arguments became more frequent, his friendships began to suffer, with many of his acquaintances distancing themselves as the couple remained together. In February 2000, a disturbing series of incidents escalated when Katherine stabbed her partner, John Price, in the chest. Frustrated by the ongoing abuse, Price ultimately decided to kick Katherine out of his house. On February 29th, he made a stop at the Scone Magistrates Court to secure a restraining order against her, aimed at protecting himself and his children. That afternoon, he expressed his grave concerns to coworkers, stating that if he failed to show up for work the following day, it would likely be due to Katherine taking his life. Despite his colleagues urging him to stay away from home, Price felt compelled to return, fearing for his children's safety. Upon arriving home, he discovered that Katherine, though not present, had sent their children to a friend's house for a sleepover. Price spent the evening socializing with neighbors before going to bed at 11 p.m. Meanwhile, Katherine had purchased new black lingerie and recorded unsettling messages involving her children, which have since been interpreted as a grotesque will. Later that night, Katherine returned to Price's home, where she watched television momentarily before showering. She then woke Price, and the two engaged in sexual activity before he fell asleep. The following morning, concerns arose when a neighbor noticed Price's car still in the driveway. When he didn't arrive at work, an employer sent a colleague to check on him. Both the neighbor and the coworker unsuccessfully tried to ruse Price by tapping on his bedroom window. Their suspicions were heightened when they noticed blood on the front door, leading them to call the police, who arrived at 8 a.m. After breaking into the house through the back door, officers discovered Price's lifeless body, while Katherine was found in a stupor after ingesting a large quantity of pills. She had fatally stabbed Price with a butcher's knife as he slept, and forensic evidence indicated that he had attempted to turn on the light and escape. He got as far as outside the home, but was dragged back in by Katherine. An autopsy revealed that Price had been stabbed at least 37 times, with wounds affecting vital organs in both the front and back of his body. On the floor next to the right arm of the deceased, investigators discovered a blood-stained knife with a 31-centimeter yellow plastic handle. The blade itself measured 17.5 centimeters in length. Disturbingly, several hours after his death, Katherine skinned him by taking all of his skin off his face, ears, scalp, and neck, like a suit, and hung his skin from a meat hook in the living room. There was only one square of his skin that she had left, and it was a piece of skin that had the scar from where she stabbed him previously. She then chopped off his head and placed it in a pot. After, she removed his buttocks as well as other parts of his body and cooked them. Katherine served the grotesque meal alongside baked potatoes, pumpkin, zucchini, cabbage, yellow squash, and gravy. Notes were placed beside each plate, bearing the names of Price's children, indicating her intention to serve the meals to them. One meal was discarded in the backyard, and it's speculated that Katherine attempted to consume it, but was unable. This has been put forward as part of her claim to have no memory of the horrific acts. Price's head was discovered in a pot with vegetables, still warm, suggesting that the cooking occurred early in the morning. At some point, Katherine arranged Price's body with his left arm draped over an empty soft drink bottle and his legs crossed, an act interpreted in court as a sign of her contempt for him. A handwritten note, stained with blood and pieces of flesh, was found atop a photograph of Price. It read, quote, "Time got you back, Jonathan, for raping my daughter. You to Beck. For Ross. For little John. Now play with little John's dick, John Price." However, the allegations in the note were later dismissed as baseless. On the morning of March 1st, 2000, Detective Sergeant Robert Wells encountered a harrowing crime scene that would remain imprinted on his memory for a lifetime. Now 65 years old, the retired officer from New South Wales, North Coast, is a husband, father, and grandfather who still grapples with the haunting images from his days on the force. Diagnosed with severe chronic post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, Robert now sees a psychologist regularly to help cope with his struggles. He acknowledges that while the case of Katherine Knight was not the sole cause of his condition, it certainly stands out as one of the most distressing incidents he has ever experienced. In a powerful condemnation of Katherine's actions, NSW Supreme Court Justice Barry O'Keefe sentenced her to life in prison on November 8, 2001. This historic ruling made her the first woman in Australia to receive a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Reflecting on the case during sentencing, the judge remarked that Katherine did not qualify for mercy due to her cruel and vicious behavior. Detective Wells was the first senior detective to arrive at the scene and vividly remembers seeing plates lined up on the dining room table with the food and John's kids' names written on sticky tape. He would say, quote, "We didn't get much information about what was going on at that house, just that we had to get there quick. I was actually stationed in another police station about 40 minutes away. By the time I got to the scene, Katherine was leaving in an ambulance. She had taken some pills, not enough to kill her, but they made her sleepy. I walked inside and saw the human skin pelt hanging up, completely intact in one piece. John Price's decapitated and skinned body was lying upward on the floor in the lounge room. We found his head. It had been boiled and cooked in a pot on the stove. There was a number of slices of rump taken off his human rump, baked in the oven with some vegetables and put on plates. with the name of 2 of his children on them. There was a lot of blood in the hallway, which started high and then ended up low, because she obviously stabbed him and then chased him down the hallway and stabbed him again. Quote, I saw Price's body on the floor with the head missing. I saw his complete pelt, what you'd call skin, complete in one piece with a butcher's hook through the top of his scalp and through the hair and hanging, hooked over the architraves of a doorway from the dining area into the lounge room. He was hanging down, then we just had a quick observation of the hall and the blood and went over to the stove in the kitchen bench where there was some meals made up with some meat and vegetables. We then had a look at the lid and took it off the big boiler pot where John's head was. He also said that Katherine had eaten some herself. He then began speaking about how the crime scene affected him and left him with PTSD. Quote, at that stage, I'd had over 20 years with the police force and I'd been through a few things. If you're an operational police officer and you're going to crime scenes as part of your daily duties, you sort of get bombarded after a while. But this was sort of the thing that was the straw that broke the camel's back. I interviewed her for a couple of hours, but she was in total denial of anything that had happened anyway. I think she was someone who was in denial, but she was a very, very strong person within herself. She's a hard woman. She was smart enough to know what was going on. You know when you catch someone's eye, you know they're lying to you. You just catch that look. You don't get it all the time, but you just catch it momentarily and you say, she knows what's going on. The fact was that Katherine had been violent towards the men she had been in relationships with over the years. They were all quite smaller than her, and it is very unusual for a woman to do this. She showed him no mercy. She has not expressed any remorse. If released, she poses a serious threat to the security of society. In all my years on the force, I've never once been called to a scene where a woman was violently beating up on a man. Most of the time, from my experience, it is men being violent towards their female partners. Katherine Knight was a very unique case. In cases where men were hurt or killed in a domestic setting, it was by another male partner, family member, friend, or acquaintance. I'm satisfied beyond any doubt that such a murder was premeditated. I'm further satisfied in the same way that not only did she plan the murder, but she also enjoyed the horrific acts which followed in its wake as part of a ritual of death and defilement. The things which she did after the death of Mr. Price indicate cognition, volition, calm, and skill. I am satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that her evil actions were playing out of her resentments arising out of her rejection by Mr. Price, her impending expulsion from Mr. Price's home, which he wanted to retain for his children. The last minutes of his life must have been a time of abject terror for him, as they were a time of utter enjoyment for her. Mr. Wells received a diagnosis of chronic severe PTSD following his retirement in 2011. He is an outspoken advocate for mental health awareness, urging both men and women, particularly those in emergency services, to seek assistance if they require it. Quote, although things have gotten better, I think there is still a lot of stigma around the issue of mental health. After 20 plus years on the jobs, you become a bit numb to everything you see. You might not feel like you're affected at that time, but it can catch up with you later. My condition is something I manage. I see a psychologist once a month. Sometimes I depend on medication. Sometimes I don't. I have a good partner who keeps me leveled and good, strong, loving children and grandchildren. They make me want to wake up every day and keep going. That's my therapy. In a significant legal development, Katherine Knight's initial proposal to plead guilty to manslaughter was declined, leading to her arraignment on February 2, 2001, on charges of murdering John Price, to which she entered a plea of not guilty. Although her trial was originally scheduled for July 23, 2001, it was postponed due to the illness of her legal counsel and rescheduled for October 15, 2001. When the trial finally began, Justice Barry O'Keefe provided the 60 potential jurors the choice to opt out due to the graphic nature of the photographic evidence, which 5 jurors accepted. As the witness list was read, several others also withdrew, and the jury was subsequently impaneled. Following a brief discussion with Katherine's attorneys, the trial was adjourned until the next day. Upon resuming, Katherine unexpectedly changed her plea to guilty, prompting the dismissal of the jury. It was later revealed that Justice O'Keefe had been informed of this change a day earlier and had ordered a psychiatric evaluation overnight to assess Katherine's understanding of the implications of her guilty plea and her fitness to enter such a plea. Katherine's defense team had intended to argue that she suffered from amnesia and disassociation, diagnoses that were generally supported by the majority of psychiatrists, though they deemed her sane. No explanation for her guilty plea has ever been provided, and despite her admission, Katherine continued to deny taking responsibility for her actions. During the sentencing hearing, her lawyers requested that she be excused from hearing certain disturbing details, but the request was denied. Katherine became hysterical when Dr. Timothy Lyons testified regarding the gruesome acts of skinning and decapitation, necessitating her sedation. On November 8th, Justice O'Keefe remarked on the heinous nature of the crime and Katherine's lack of remorse, ultimately sentencing her to life imprisonment. He also declined to set a non-parole period and directed that her papers be marked never to be released, making her the first woman in Australian history to receive such a sentence. In June 2006, Katherine appealed the life sentence, arguing that the penalty was excessively harsh for the murder. However, in September, Justices Peter McClellan, Michael Adams, and Megan Latham of the NSW Court of Criminal Appeal dismissed the appeal. Justice McClellan noted in his judgment, "This was an appalling crime, almost beyond contemplation in a civilized society." I spoke about the psychological impact that working in a slaughterhouse has on people in another episode, but I want to quote the findings of a recent study on this topic called The Psychological Impact of Slaughterhouse Employment, a systematic literature review by Jessica Slade and Emma Aileen. Quote, "The findings from this review were demarcated by the focus of studies 1. The prevalence of mental health disorders, 2. The types of coping mechanisms used, and 3. The link between slaughterhouse employment and crime perpetration. It was found that slaughterhouse workers have a higher prevalence rate of mental health issues, in particular, depression and anxiety, in addition to violence-supportive attitudes. Furthermore, the workers employ a variety of both adaptive and maladaptive strategies to cope with the workplace environment and associated stressors. Finally, there is some evidence that slaughterhouse work is associated with increased crime levels. The research reviewed has shown a link between slaughterhouse work and antisocial behavior generally and sexually offending specifically. I've linked this study in the show notes if you're interested in reading the rest. It is very informative. I'd also like to bring up the McDonald triad, as I have in many other cases I've covered. Harming animals is one of the characteristics, along with fire setting and bedwetting. Katherine had a long history of violence with animals and humans. I believe her working in a butcher shop also added to her violent tendencies, as she more than likely got pleasure out of it. Katherine is now 67 years old, and she is serving out her life sentence at Silverwater Prison. I hope that John Price's family feels that they got justice and that they don't have horrible images of what happened to him in their minds. I couldn't imagine how hard it must have been to hear about this case and see the evidence. As always, all evidence will be linked in the show notes. Photos will be available on our Instagram at Murder Tapes Podcast. Feel free to also follow my personal at Annalisa. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope to see you on the next one.